Yeah, what is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and I am here with the one and the only Bo Daddy. Oh, yeah, it's time to nerd out with your geek out on the Theology Nerd Throwdown. Woo! Bo, are you ready for some fun?
I have been looking forward to this. Are we going to call this like a crisis edition, a cultural chaos edition?
Oh.
I
should have a sound effect for that.
I am both caffeinated
No,
and
say it again. I'm going to hit one of these buttons that I kind of. Okay. All right, say it. Do it again. Do it. I'm ready. No, you have to say the edition or whatever.
Crisis edition. That's a nice stinger.
Yeah.
Tripp, couple housekeeping matters.
Oh, are you gonna get me to do chores, Bo?
The opposite.
Okay.
I wanted to compliment you. You have been cranking out episodes of that podcast.
Of what do you mean?
Your podcast stream has been prolific lately.
Oh, you know, Josh, the editor, like actually make sure they come out.
Is that what's happening?
You know, the pace of podcast release really changes if you're personally editing.
I know. You know, I was doing something on my computer the other day, and I saw GarageBand, which I used to use when I was the editor, and I haven't used it actually in quite a while. And I realized like how labor intensive using GarageBand was. And I can't believe how far technology has come in like literally 5 or 8 years.
Yeah. When people start podcasts now and they are like, oh, I'm just having so much trouble with insert almost anything. I'm like, now like if you use like Descript, you know, you can edit at the transcript level.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It will use AI just to clean up the person's vocals.
Unbelievable.
You can ask it to make like, oh, well, here's 10 possible titles about your thing.
What?
You can ask it all sorts of stuff about what happens in it, and it'll suggest edits. And you know, I still find that cumbersome. I like to keep it authentic.
Yeah, so I have a young person in my congregation who wants to start a podcast. Actually has a really good idea for a podcast about he's not calling it not spiritual abuse, but like recovering from spiritual trauma. That's what it is. And I think it has some real merit, but he was asking me like, how should I get started? And I literally, you'll find this funny. I pulled out my old Zoom, I think it's called a Zoom MP3 recorder.
Yeah.
And you could like plug old style microphones into it with phantom power. And you record, and then you have to plug it into your computer and transfer the MP3 file and then edit it in GarageBand. And I was like, I think you should just use the new stuff that people are using because this was cumbersome.
Yeah, I use one of those as a backup.
Yeah, sure.
You know, but like this thing that we're streaming on, this is cool. Like, do you remember when we used some little dongle and we had like a whole freaking sound system in that office that we
took up a card table.
Yeah, that we kind of were allowed to use at Claremont. And no one had been in this room forever. And Phil gave us a key. And we had like a sound system with all of our sound stuff going into it. And then out the back of it, and like its little headphone jack, 1/8 of an inch, it goes into that little red thing we had that then went into USB into a different computer.
Yep.
And then streamed just the audio online, and people would it was called Mixler. Mixler was the thing that we streamed that audio on.
I mean, it's just really funny. Hey, can I tell you a John Cobb story? I know that you put out an episode remembering John Cobb. When I first got to Claremont in 2008, I got an invitation to John's house for breakfast, and, so my wife and I went over, and I stopped at this really boutique, donut shop and bought some artisan fancy donuts because I wanted to impress John Cobb. So we get over there, and, we only have a limited amount of time because, his wife was, on bed rest at that point, and so, I go into the kitchen because John doesn't want an entire donut, right? That's, like, too much for him, but he wanted to try.
Well, he's like half of us.
Yeah, he was a
John's like our leg.
and, but he wanted to try each of these gourmet donuts, and so I went into his kitchen, and I cut each of them into quarters, right? So he could have a quarter of each of the things. And, when I get back, my wife, who had been to China, I had never been to China, she had been over there to visit her sister, who at the time was a missionary, and John and my wife were comparing notes about China and how missions had changed and all, and they ended up talking the entire time, and then John had to go, and I never got to ask him the questions that I went over there for breakfast to ask him, and I was so put off, and I said to my wife, like, "What was that?"
You got yeah, you're
I
like,
was a little bent out of shape.
"You ruined my Cobb time."
Yeah.
Well,
So,
why are you, like, connecting with him and sharing stories?
yeah, they
Like,
were like
I had
they
questions.
they were over at the bookshelf, and he had, like, souvenirs and, memorabilia from his, travels and his upbringing, and they were talking about all sorts of cultural stuff, and anyway, she took up my entire breakfast with, John Cobb.
It's funny, like, I mean, so he was a Methodist missionary kid in Japan growing up, but has
Right,
spent so much time in China.
right.
Like, during his, 98th birthday party, there are, like, schools named after John Cobb in China, and, like,
What?
they live streamed in, like, whole school choirs singing the equivalent of happy birthday to John, 'cause in the '80s or so connected or '90s
Yeah.
with the equivalent of the vice president,
Oh,
and has been helping their whole, like, ecological development stuff and thing, and now there's, like, 30 some process centers at different universities there. There's a whole Whitehead school, um, uh, and so it's it's just fascinating because you take, like, how we show respect, but you
yeah,
don't get more respect when you're 90 something, right?
right.
Like, this is America.
Yeah,
Like, unless you're president and that old, then, we don't talk about you. But there, the older you get, like, you get more
that's
cultural
amazing.
respect. So you take off, like, this guy that shows up, has these relationships, invested, is, like, helping build bridges between America and China. They recognize him and all these kind of things, and then if
I
you
know.
have no context, which I mean, I knew more than the people I was sitting next to during the
Yeah,
birthday party, and they're like,
yeah.
"Oh, well, some of our friends from China," and then it's like 300 kids singing him for him, and you're like, "What? What? I thought this was like a process theologian." And they're like, "Oh, he helped, develop the first, sustainable city
Yeah.
models." And
I I heard him give a
he was
present.
the one that got them not to create whole new cities, but
Yeah,
to keep the agricultural communities intact and modify them in particular ways. Like, you start hearing it and you're like,
yeah,
"Yeah." And
yeah.
it was like, what do I do in my spare time as a theologian?" It's like, I play on the internet."
Yep.
John Cobb's like, "Development policy in China."
I heard him give a presentation one time about why cultures that have a Confucian, heritage orientation are more, compatible with process thought, relational thought, and, it was a bit over my head at the time, but I just was fascinated with some of the examples that he was using, and, yeah, I just anyway, I have, great memories of encounters with John Cobb and listening to presentations, all of which were clearly over my head and outside my, scope, but I just loved his life and investment in humanity.
Do you remember I feel like this was early on, like, right after you got to school, when he did that talk on, like, Earth Day
Yeah.
called "Is It Too Late?" On the anniversary of because he
Yeah.
wrote, like, the first eco-theology
It's
book.
71, I think.
Yeah, and so it was like me and you, Bill Walker,
Yeah.
Austin, or what
Austin Roberts.
like, we we go to this talk thing, in
I do
Butler
know.
201, and then we're going out after it, and, like, we're at the press or whatever, and, you know, there's a difference between, like, I'm aware of ecological crisis,
Yeah.
and then I'm Claremont aware,
Yeah.
and John also not gonna sugarcoat much. So we get to the press, and there's, like, this feeling of, like, "Well, that was intense,"
Yeah.
And, and you're like this is a restaurant we went to quite a bit, uh, which has, low price pints of Arrogant Bastard, which is
Yes.
not a person. It's, this is a beer, and 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 Poe just does some toast. I can't remember what you said. It was like you were gonna say something, and then you're like, "Whatever," 'cause you were like, "To the ah," and and we didn't end up talking about it at all, but it was just one of those things where it's
Oh,
like,
man.
we were all thinking, "Ooh, that was intense.
Yeah.
Are we discussing this?" And
You
he
know,
toasted, and it was like, "Nope, and we're moving on."
man, I tell you, I was really awakened, during that period, and I think you remember, I was actually really honored when he put on the Pando Populus, Eco Civilization. I don't remember the subtitle. It was really cool.
Seizing the alternative.
Oh, okay. And I actually got to present an idea that ultimately, I don't know if you remember the reception in the room, people really did not enjoy my presentation and didn't think it had a lot of merit. But that was I don't know if you remember that, but it was my ironic and constructive proposal for how we might bridge the gap between the drill baby drill evangelicals and the progressive mainliners who were concerned about civilization and the ecological disaster awaiting us. No one went with me, and I think I just bummed everyone out in the room talking about crisis and conflict.
Well, luckily now, I mean,
Right?
evangelicals have really tampered
I
themselves down. They've really dialed back that drill baby drill agenda.
I've thought about going back and reworking that proposal but almost like ironically, like, just like admitting defeat.
I the the thing I remember from that was Brian McLaren
Yeah,
being like, "I think you and Tom should just explain Whitehead." And then me and Tom not knowing how the other one's going to do it, and
yeah,
we're proceeding to kind of collaboratively introduce
yeah.
Whitehead.
What for dummies.
Yeah, and
To
and where
the
you're, like, sitting
uninitiated.
there and you're, like, looking at each other and then looking at everyone else and being like, "Do are we still doing this? Are we doing okay?"
That would have been in, like, 2015, I think, and I'm guessing. It was definitely pre-election 2016, I
Oh,
know
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And, what was interesting, speaking of the podcast stream, you put out one that was from the Theology Beer Camp. It was the conversation between the Tillich, folks in the Ground of Being and the, Process folks,
Yeah.
and that was a really fun listen. My favorite part is you rarely hear Tom Ord, um, get either snarky
Uh-huh.
or, um, he was in his, like, pugilistic best.
It was funny, like, before it, he's like, "Hey, I think
Oh,
I'm gonna
really?
try to,"
Oh,
you know
really?
he, like, warned everyone, he's like, I'm gonna commit to the bit,
Oh,
you know?
funny.
And
That's funny.
I was just like,
You rarely see him do that.
"Don't you wanna know what, like, getting in trouble in his house would look like? Like, if you were his kid? If that's like, dad's like, I I think you're basically sexy version of Aquinas." You're like, "I'm sorry, dad. I was
Oh my
trying to
goodness,
sneak the unmoved mover around the side."
man. You know what's funny? So if you're a Methodist pastor, we always start our job on July 1, all of us, when we get reappointed.
So that
And
you
then
get to preach a patriotic sermon to kick off your
it is
tenure?
weird, and it's always a communion week. It is a weird way to start, admittedly. Well, yeah, anyway. Um
Well, you know, there are 2 people that died for your freedom, Bo.
Whoa. So, but the fun part is normally that 1st October, you don't get, what did she say? Do you have the link for that trip? Oh, yeah.
I don't it depends on what the link is for.
I think we're talking about the process, Tilikian thing.
Oh, it's on the podcast, Lori.
Yeah, just
It
go to
came out at the beginning of the week. Yep, beginning of the week.
normally, you don't get a performance review your 1st October. So normally staff gets a performance review in the fall, and that way, if you're gonna get a pay raise, SPRC, who's like our HR committee, recommends it to finance, who takes it to church council. And that way in December, they vote on the budget and you get your cost of living increase, right? But your first year, you normally don't get a performance review. And so I didn't get one last year, but my SPRC decided that we wanted to do one. It was a little delayed, but I just got my first performance review of how I'm doing. And so apparently, some people, in contrast to Tom Ward, who's also from Idaho, or lives in Idaho, some people experience me as a little intense. And so I've been thinking all week of just about cultural uh, differences.
Uh-huh.
And especially when you are in a more agricultural community where people are usually long term. They've been here a long time, sometimes generations, but definitely for their whole life. And the manner of telling stories is sometimes drawn out. There are long, long introductions before someone gets to the point. And
Yeah.
so,
I'm a fan of long introductions.
yeah, that's true. You would fit in well. But anyway, I was thinking about Tom and I'm like, you know, it makes sense why he fits in so well here. He's so kind and, patient and not my greatest strength all the time. So, especially when it's drop-ins. Like if somebody makes an appointment and I can mentally prepare myself, but it turns out it's when people just drop by and they right and I was doing something else. So I have to stop doing that. And then I'm listening and I'm thinking, yeah, but what do you need? What are you here for? And
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
I had
so
to just do half my work week not at the church because I just can't do the, like,
the
"You're
drop
bored.
in.
You're bored and came by, and now I'm not doing my work,
Yeah.
but I'm still gonna be expected to have everything done, but you're not needing pastoral care. You aren't, like there's no committee work that's going on. You just are retired, and you were near the church, and you thought to yourself,
Yeah.
"I'm just gonna pop in and talk to Tripp because he'll talk." And when I will, but then I get done, and then I have to work at night, and then I'm like, I'm also
Oh,
working on a
yeah.
PhD,
Oh.
and then so I just started doing the only showing up at the office in the 2 days that we had our big retired people, social gatherings.
Oh, no.
So, 1, they can't come in while they're doing their thing, and
Yeah.
then 2, they'll all come over after, and then I just know, like, I'm socializing.
That's
Um,
your day.
and then the other times I worked at Coffee Cartel right there. the coffee
Oh,
shop right at the
you
turn.
didn't work at the coffee shop. You did your church work at the
Yeah,
coffee
I just
Yeah,
sat
yeah,
there
yeah. Okay. I was gonna say,
until
I didn't know
until
you
they
worked
outlawed cigar smoking on the patio until after 3 PM.
Oh, California.
I know. I know. Yeah.
Oh, Josh, I think I know this guy.
You have
I
to
think
read the comment. Most people are listening to this, Bo.
Josh says, I had a guy who would send me an email, call about said email, and then show up at the church an hour later to talk about said email. And this was a weekly occurrence. I know this person.
They moved
Yeah.
from, I guess, Florida, where Josh was working now, out all the way out to Idaho.
We had
You
a memorial service last week for a saint, who had lived a wonderful life into her 90s. But her son did the ceremony. He conducted the memorial service, and he's Lutheran minister. And Tripp, it's been a long time since I was at a Lutheran church service. Now, it was in our Methodist sanctuary, but it was a Lutheran church service. I gotta tell you, man, it's one of those things because when you're not expecting it, things can surprise you, And it is one of those things that every time I'm in the sanctuary now, I keep thinking about elements of that. It was like a cross-cultural experience. It was wild. But anyway, him and I had many, many emails back and forth trying to arrange what would become the service. Holy guacamole, man. That was something.
It was something. So you should tell me what we were going to talk about.
Oh, you've been thinking a lot about Crisis lately, and you wanted to tell me something about Crisis.
I know,
And
but when you texted me what you wanted to talk about, I remember you already said this. So you should talk about yours first, then
Oh,
decide
really?
how
Oh,
much time we have.
oh,
But I was
okay.
gonna also tell you, I'm pretty sure in the next week we'll know the location for camp. So I'm very excited.
Yeah, I saw you put out
Little teaser.
what?
Little teaser.
Yeah, a teaser, but it had some things redacted. Some
Yeah.
important information was
Yeah.
blacked out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a secret.
Yeah.
It's a secret.
Well, I will look forward to finding out where we're going.
I mean, I'll tell you,
Oh,
but
you
I'm
tell
not
me
gonna
later. Okay.
tell you on a live stream.
No, you wouldn't.
Then
Why would you?
no, I was just building anticipation.
All right.
And yeah. All right, you sent me something in Latin.
That's funny. Talk and type does not work if you use academic language and you're using like biblical Greek or Latin phrases. Talk and type does not know, or autocorrect, I should just say, does not know what the heck to do with. So yeah, that was a funny text. I had to edit it several times. It kept fixing it for me, quote unquote.
Fixing.
Here's what's going on. I asked a question on the live stream several weeks ago about the appeal of this new conservatism. And so I've been going back and doing some research. So let me tell you a little bit about this journey I've been on, and I'd love to pick your brain on it. So in 2010, 9, I took a class called Liberalism and Its Critics with Rich Amesbury. It's a PhD seminar. Some of the material that we read was Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, John Rawls' Political Theology, Michael Sandel's Communitarianism, feminist critiques of such material. So I've been going back and rereading all of that. And but I've also been looking at some newer material that has come out since 2019 and this real backlash against the cultural chaos, the moral morass that it gets called, of this liberal society that led up to what now we are in with this new administration in American politics. And the ideological underpinnings behind it. And so I've been doing a lot of research, and I wanted to revisit with you. I wanted to revisit with you some of the concepts that I'm finding because I've made two what I think are pretty important clarifying discoveries about my initial question. So, what I started with is I started with the question: is the conservative backlash, this thing that we're experiencing, is it rooted in the same concern as the critique of liberalism? Like, are they housed in the same umbrella, right? Are they part of the same ecosystem? Are they rooted in the same family, if you will? Right? Do they have a similar genealogy? That's sort of where I started.
Would that be a similar, like the critique of liberalism, meaning kind of like the illiberal side of the left? Is that like the populist, like kind of populist energy, but that across perspectives?
Yeah, yeah. So like if you take an Alistair McIntyre, and even by the way, Stanley Hauerwas has done great work on taking McIntyre's critique of liberalism seriously and also providing what I think is a pretty constructive Christian response. Um, so the reason this is so intriguing to me is because I find myself in an interesting position in that I would identify myself as a social constructivist. That's sort of my philosophical commitment. And part of that comes from a postmodern sensibility, but part of that also comes from, feminist writings about whether it's, I mean, it gets called like substantial, right? Um, Essentialism. That stuff has really influenced me. And so I could rightly, though, be mistaken for one of these communitarians. Like, I'm really sympathetic with folks like Alistair McIntyre, Michael Sandel, Stanley Hauerwas. I'm not committed to that. I find myself very sympathetic, and I could probably be mistaken for that pretty easily, except for the concern of people like Susan Heckman. Um, that when they talk about virtue and reclaiming an Aristotelian notion of morality, the unfortunate thing is that it is rooted in a patriarchal, um, it's embedded with sexism and racism, right? Because of its Greek roots. So I often find myself sort of on an island. I don't have many people who think like me or are committed to community, collaboration, cooperation, the common good. What I find myself is in between two increasingly adversarial groups of people. I have my liberal, democratic voting friends and family, and I have my conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist, Republican voting friends and family, both of whom I love, but neither of which do I identify with or feel committed to. But in my church world, I often find people who are moderates, um, who sort of try and find a middle way. They're always trying to find a middle way. But I just find that increasingly compromised and not intriguing at all. Right.
Mhm.
So then instead of the middle way, sometimes I have some friends who are far leftists who and Christian, and they are sort of committed to what they call it like a third way, right? So it's not a middle way. They're not moderates. They're not. That's a third way, an outsides, right? So those are sort of the 4 groups that I'm in conversation with the most, none of which do I find compelling enough to commit to. So I'm often just on an island by myself, sort of in this concern about the demise, if you will. You know, you can read it in books like Bowling Alone, you know, that famous book from a while ago. It's just about the disintegration of our culture and the bonds that tie us together. All of that is to say, that's all background, to say that I have, since that podcast we did about the Conserva Curious, I have found myself being more sympathetic with a group that I vehemently disagree with, nearly violently react to, as far as
Nearly violently. We don't need you getting
no,
violent, though.
no real violence. Just my reaction would be visceral. I should say visceral instead of violent. So when I hear people like, you know, say a JD Vance stick up for his conception of the traditional family, I am starting to understand, the more I research the background material behind it, I am starting to understand the draw of, say, people who are adult converts to Catholicism and the sort of institutional framework that that provides, but more of a conservatism, the defense of the traditional family and all that comes with that. I'm starting to get what they're saying, because especially after the most recent election, when many of my left-leaning and Democrat voting friends were more than devastated, just gut-wrenched. I have weekly meetings where people are just like balloons with the air has been let out of them. They're sad in a way and concerned, you know, sometimes fearful, but more than that, they're just confused and demoralized. And as I listen to them, I find myself saying, but you understand why that approach is failing, right? You see that we're at sort of the end. Like I'm starting to come around and understand post-liberalism, and that we're at the end of something. That liberalism was great at delivering from the parochial, um, class-oriented, you know, caste system inherited in Western Europe, and it delivered us into where people could be the best of themselves and they could upgrade, you know, their life and their education and their income, and this progressive impulse of that each generation could successfully be better off than the generations that came before them, right? But we started in the, I'm going to say, the late 60s with the civil rights movement, the Woodstock era, the Vietnam crisis, the Watergate. We started to enter into a time of real cultural, not just division, but a fragmentation. And so, you know, the critique of things like, let's say, consumer culture and its end in the hipsters who, you know, sort of people point to as the end of Western civilization. But we're seeing it in our politics now. And unfortunately for me, the line that you introduced me to that has has haunted me and has been my main motivation to pursue this research. You said that politics is now upstream of religion. And Tripp, I don't know where you got that phrase from, but ever since you introduced me to it, I have been unsettled with this notion. And my pastoral ministry is making more, when I say more sense than ever, what I mean is less sense than ever, because I'm realizing that that reality is impacting nearly every aspect of people's lives. It's their relationship to their children and grandchildren, their commitment to communities like their church. And so I have been going through sort of an internal sorting, where when I talk to my more conservative friends and family, I'm hearing them in a different way, and their concern about the lack of moral clarity, any sort of notion of virtue, and just the loss of an orientation towards anything other than self and identitarianism, if you will. And but as I listen to my more liberal and Democratic voting friends and family, and just their heartbroken, gut wrenched sort of evaluation of where things have gone wrong, I'm finding so many common themes. So my new favorite phrase comes from Zizek. I've loved it for years, but it has moved way up the ranks and is now my favorite phrase. The Democrats and the Republicans are both wrong, but they're right about each other. That's my paraphrase of the Zizek notion. And as I listen to people, and whether they are committed to a middle way, not being pulled into the polarization and animosity of our current situation, or they're looking for a third way, saying, look, this bipartisan congressional gridlock is failing us, and I want something entirely different. The more I listen to people, the more common threads and themes I'm finding. And so I have begun a project. This is why I want to pick your brain. I would love to propose a constructive alternative where we reverse this trend that politics is now upstream of religion, and I'm going to say this for Tim Burnett's sake, reclaim um, that a notion of the ecclesia, right, our small gatherings, as polis, that our politics would be downstream of our ecclesiology, and that our notion of whatever it is we're calling church or doing at church would be upstream and inform our politic, and that we abandon this polarized, partisan, democratic notion that is failing us at nearly every level, and we return to some notion, not of the past. I don't mean return in that way, but that we formulate, maybe that's what I should say, formulate some notion that our ecclesiology, our ecclesia, become our politic. And that way we can partner with whatever party brings about what we see as the greater good, the telos. And so it's more of a teleological approach instead of whatever we've been doing up to this point. And the smarty pants that I read, they debate the Kantian deontological, right, duty. They debate the utilitarian notion, right? In especially in our postmodern context, it gets boiled down to like a cynicism, like whatever it takes to get done. Like I'm not interested in any of that. But we have to come up with some hopeful alternative to this breakdown of society, this culture of conflict and chaos. And when you look at our young people, if the alternatives are a conservative reclamation of the traditional family and the moral structures provided by traditional, let's call them patriarchal religion, right? If that's one alternative. But if the other alternative is the free for all, hedonistic, do what's ever best for you um, within a consumer context, we have to come up with something better than what's being offered, especially to our young people now, because this notion of the autonomous self is buckling in ways that are really, really hurting our youth and young people and their notions of achievement, self, value, the lack of orientation towards virtue and any notion of morality. Like, this is what I'm hearing out there. So I wanted to just pile it all on the desk and go, hey, Tripp, what do you think of that?
What part should I talk about first?
what part snagged you first?
Well, there's the whole like account of modernity, like the diagnosis of modernity and liberalism, which I think how one diagnoses it changes how you see the problem and what the responses to these different groups look like.
Agree.
So that's like one little bucket that could be explored.
Okay.
Another thing about the proposal at the end that I would it would require, or at least in my head, it would require a kind of sameness at the local community level akin to something like the Quakers, right? Where in order for your community life at the polis level to be upstream from your politics, then it requires a kind of sameness for the community to experience a shared teleology, right?
Whoa.
So, and it's a teleology and a narrative that sets one over against culture, which is what evangelicals tell themselves. It's just they are the most powerful voting bloc in America.
Wait a minute. What's over and against culture?
So like if you have ecclesia as polis, right? Like if the church, how would you form a community that's upstream of politics? Would mean that the individuals have to think that the relationships in which they are seen most fully, that the fullness of themselves are recognized, occurs in a community, at a local level, which we're alienating from all local level communities that do that, right? Which has basically started since the time of the TV, and it's gotten worse.
Yep.
So there's that part. It would also run counter to what almost any religious person that's not a fundamentalist wants, because we still think religion is primarily about beliefs. And so then everyone needs to have the same beliefs. And you would be combating everything else in culture that says, oh, no, we sort ourselves by beliefs. And you're like, no, we don't sort ourselves by beliefs, but we have the same telos. But the biggest feature that came out at the end, and then we can jump back to like the diagnosing part, and you can just try to steer me away from a 15-minute rant about how JD Vance is like the hair on Satan's testicle. The I mean, he like told the Pope he wasn't Catholic. Like, can you really convert to Catholicism? Tell the Pope you're not Catholic, and your entire existence is funded by Peter Thiel, who said like democracy and capitalism aren't compatible, and I choose capitalism. Like, what a POS! Jesus is like, you can choose God or Mammon, and Peter Thiel's like, I know what I'm choosing, and I'm going to get JD Vance to do it and tell everyone we're reclaiming biblical conservative values, and you're just really just letting Satan claim the military industrial complex and techno surveillance state in order to get whatever the 1% want. Anyway, and do you remember, I don't know if you were still on the podcast or not, when JD Vance was coming on the podcast and then he just canceled, he ghosted me.
No.
And then like 2 weeks later, he comes out MAGA because, he's like, his publicist is like, I want to connect with mainline Protestants. I'm reconnecting my faith. And there's like this whole populist working class right streak. And he wants to come on your podcast. And then like a few weeks later, he's like, I'm going MAGA. Peter Thiel gave me money. And now I'm going to be, carrying water for whatever you want to call that. Anyway, I emailed him back and be like, do you still want to come on the podcast? I got some questions. And anyway, but the other side of it, and here are the two things I would put, and I mostly want to just say them, and then you come tell me what you think later. Think it through. Okay, so part of that desire, I think that in modernity, this the recognition of the need for pluralism, right? And this is how we resolved the 30 Years' War, how we came to have nation states, religious liberty, and stuff like that, meant that we had to make space for a kind of pluralism that human beings have not done before.
Right.
We've had pluralism at the level of of diversity held in check by violence with someone at the top, or a pluralism with who's the permitted heretic, but everyone knows what the shared sacred story of any culture is. And then they battle each other, conquer each other, witness to each other, or just ignore each other till time comes that someone has a natural resource or whatever, But there has been a narrative continuity at the level of culture and interaction until we got to modernity. And it's in that space where Christians start doing, right, in some sense, what happened in the early church, right? Paul, the ecclesia, the assembly of the citizens of heaven, like all this language that are church words were the language Rome applied to newly conquered territories, right? So they conquer, and then they have an ecclesia, a church of the true citizens of the true empire. And Paul's basically doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But once the church becomes culture dominant, that is not how religious identity functioned for the overwhelming majority of people in the West. And then you get to this space of, how do we sort the nation states? And then you have like, well, this is the Protestant state, these ones are Lutherans, this is this, and then over time, it gets more and more diverse. And now there's like now Britannica is smaller than the Handbook of Denominations. So when you get to that kind of pluralism and such, who were the ones that developed self-consciously ecclesia-centric identity in liberal modernity? It's the Anabaptists, it's Quakers, Shakers, the early Pentecostal movement, right? So there's some marker that makes your identity with your particular local religious community claim you in a fullness and give you an identity before each other and before God, that calls into a deep allegiance, right? It's like it's a similar social dynamic to what happens in the early church context. And I think one of the difficult things of suggesting that now is how few people that aren't fundamentalists believe anything that significantly.
I know.
I think they just, I think they do. As someone who, like you, has a deep piety, like are Christian AF, and very open intellectually and such, but if we called a bunch of our friends that are similar to us, that couldn't get jobs in the tradition that birthed us, which we find nuts. I'm just like, how am I a heretic? I'm like, I talk to Jesus more than half your church. And that's when I'm struggling to believe God exists. I still talk to Jesus. WTF. Anyway, so like and we could list our number of our friends who have like a deeply Christocentric reality, have been intellectually curious and faithful, and then we were told like, oh, you don't fit.
Mhm.
Then we work at mainline Protestant churches,
That's right.
and they're like, what? No, 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 this was Jesus flavored Morning Joe. That's what we came here for. Um,
Mm.
and you know what the crescendo of our faith is? When Trump shows up in the National Cathedral and the bishop gives like a little invitation to just not be a dick.
Let's not.
And no one would have paid attention to it unless he got upset and complained about it.
Yeah.
Like, that's why. It was just like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, we yeah," and look, it's fine. Honestly, she said more aggressive things politically in other sermons after, and it has nothing to do with her, it's more the reaction. That then people are like, "Yes, that's what we like." But you know what she didn't say in that? That, like, I imagine you, me, or I could list off plenty of other people, if you got to say what you were saying, you would say something like, "Hey, I know it's really awkward that you're in a job where to accept it is to betray who God is revealed to be in Christ, because you're going to lord over people and build crosses for our neighbors, our enemies, our non-human neighbors, and future generations. And that is such a difficult moral situation to be in. It's hard to imagine.
Oh my.
Like, just like, there wasn't any honesty about that. She didn't go like, "Oh, well, could you treat the kids in Palestine okay?" Um, so, it was basically the things Joe Scarborough and Mika get upset about. Could you be nice about it? And then all of a sudden, all these mainline Protestant people, plenty of them go to churches I worked at and yours, and are like, yes, that's the mainline Protestants I wanted. And you know what she wanted? She was like, can't we just be nice? Like, we want to go to our church and not hate our government because we actually like the perks of being the educated, liberal side of the domination system of the day. And but none of it was our allegiance to Christ might actually put us at odds with you. It was like, could you please be
Right.
nice? Don't invade our churches when you're stealing immigrants. Just wait till they go outside. Like, there's this uh
Mm.
like, just in the difference of that event, I think you see how at the National Cathedral, someone doing it, she wasn't making a claim on the church's identity and going like, "This is who we are.
Mm.
This
Mm.
is upstream of you." And she could have said, "Mr. President, I'm really worried if you follow through with what you say, that the government is full of baptized members of Christ's body, and they won't be able to comply because their ultimate lordship is to the one who they proclaimed in their baptism." Like, but that should be the question you ask. Like, if you're just a basic Christian,
Yeah.
confession, Jesus is Lord. It's what we said when we got baptized or when you got confirmed. And there's not a lot of ambiguity of what Jesus thinks about certain things. So he's either
Mhm.
Lord or, well, not. And so it's your call. Like, it's not personal. It's not even like mean. It's just like, we don't want that. We want civil religion. Both like, that mainline religion is nostalgic for actual mainline religion in the 50s, and conservatives want like traditional families without the tax structure, right? Like, they don't really want 70% tax on wealth or whatever. They're like, can we keep really low taxes but still
Mhm.
make Nick at Night shows cultural expectations? So the that was a long aside. See, I told you JD Vance would get me distracted. But
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but I do think there is a kind of sameness that, uh, as long as our solidarity or identity as Christians is determined by assent to beliefs, we won't have local communities that could be upstream of anything. The second part of it is, uh,
Mm.
um, I think the biggest feature for social deterioration, apart from it, is the accelerating nature of our economic system and the digitization of our relationships. And so we need
Mm.
to ask the question of like the medium and the message question about how we relate as Christians to our neighbors and how we relate as citizens. And when the medium are algorithmically driven towards tribes that generate resentment, scapegoating, fear mongering, or whatever, the
Mm.
medium itself of so much of our relationships politically and religiously is not going to be combated by the 3 hours in the entire month they spend at a church with us preaching and holding the Eucharist, because they probably check their phone during it, go to the bathroom, and are like, oh, look, we got a good truther here. Or they're going to check, truth.com, Twitter, or Blue Sky, depending on their voting allegiance. Um, and and then everything that happens in the week, is it being filtered by us going through the liturgical calendar and prayer together? No, it's being filtered by who in your tribe says the craziest and most animated thing to get tweeted, retweeted, or shared on Facebook or whatever. So that medium is a message thing. I don't know. I kind of like your whole project. Andy Root and I were talking about this, and you may even think this is fun. So then we can help. Okay, we want to get 3 or 4 of the big kind of like social philosophers that talk about this to do lectures and dialogues with clergy. And then after it, right? So everyone reads these social philosophers, right? And then you interact with them. Then we try as a group to work through ecclesiology questions, because um I think we're like trying to put band-aids on something
Yes.
and we aren't aware. So there's the
Yes.
medium, the message one, and the other distinction is the difference between the context and the content. And we usually make tribes based on the content of their beliefs. And I think and this is something Charles Taylor talks about, is it the context actually matters more than the context if you're trying to understand the features of our cultural discontent. The context that are shared across these things. And here's some examples, just because you mentioned McIntyre,
Yeah.
and that turned into the Tripp does his what did McIntyre say and how does it relate to what Bo's doing. Um, so Alistair McIntyre in After Virtue, he talks about the collapse of a shared moral framework, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so when modern moral discourse gets like so incoherent because it lacks any unifying tradition, then
Yeah.
moral arguments in contemporary society appear rational, but they're actually just expressions of fragmented and incompatible moral frameworks pulled together bricolage style from different places. And
Right.
the actual binding factor is that a community holds it militantly in the face of everyone else, rather than like them having an internal logic and structure. It's like the moral form is claiming the legitimacy of a past tradition in a context it never talked to.
Yeah.
And so like take, he'll talk about justice or rights as concepts. They have been stripped from whatever their original meaning or context was. And then we make moral debates about them. But he's like, what does even the word mean? How are we using it? So there's this collapse of a moral framework, which was required for the pluralism necessary to avoid fights when you have religious and cultural pluralism, right?
Okay.
So religious, cultural pluralism, liberal good, consequence of it. We have trouble with a moral framework. Second one, he goes, we were led into this, right? All the early Enlightenment thinkers like Kant, Hume, Bentham, company, they're like, look, it's okay. We can have individuals have individual expression of their religious traditions because we're being guided by reason. Enlightenment project style. It's a nice, universal, solid foundation. You don't have to like justify things with your sneaky religion or, oh, it's just my tradition or whatever. No. We got a nice little structure, rational facts, data, work it out. Is true for everyone in every place if they just wise up. And that's why we educate everyone, because reading and thinking and all this stuff is good, because we're going to get to a crescendo. We'll understand what we'll get to the end of history, praise God. And so as a result, moral claims in modernity, when the Enlightenment project doesn't work, get reduced. And he says it gets reduced to emotivism. The idea that
Yeah.
moral judgments are just expressions of personal preference. So
Yeah.
you moralize a preference, or they're just sentiment, not objective truths, but you don't admit that's the case. right?
Oh,
So you just
okay.
yell louder. So, and let's say you could make executive orders, you just stick them on there, and then think, oh, look, all the trans soldiers disappeared. Hey, look, all the anyway. So like emotivism becomes a replacement, but it functions with the authority that the Enlightenment notion of reason claims, right? So uh, it's just biblical Christianity. Oh, we're just following the Constitution. We're just following the law. Like Stephen Miller this last week on Sunday News Show or on Jake Tapper's getting quizzed on all the immigration stuff, and he's like acting as if the reason we've never had any immigration reform is because of the Democrats, and the Democrats will act like we haven't had immigration reform because of Republicans, and the real reason is because multinational companies want the free cheap labor and not to have to do workers' rights, and because the real people in charge are not even the lawmakers at this point.
Yeah.
We've agreed to not change a law because the populace won't like it, and so the market gets its will done despite the fact the laws around immigration have never changed. And then you get it all the way up to a crisis like this, so that now people are demanding action, and the series of inaction legitimates a horrible action. And what's he do? I'm just being rational. We're just following the law. This is blah, 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 blah. And you're like, are you? Is this really what we're doing? The other side of it, the other two elements that McIntyre pointed out is that kind of modernity as opposed to like real like deliberation about the good or whatever, or what we should do, or engaging democracy, we actually end up outsourcing everything to managerial or bureaucratic structures. And those structures have their own logic that's thoroughly enlightenment, efficiency, effectiveness over moral goods, virtue, community formation, right? So part of our problem, right? The part of even the reason politics that are what frame the narratives that sees us most of the day electronically have become our religions, and now our actual religions are downstream of it. Part of that is because uh, we've decided or bought into the truth that the neoliberal dream is that that ethics is an engineering problem, that the right bureaucracy or structure or system will do it. One side thinks that the government should learn how to do it really well and take responsibility, and the other one thinks it should be outsourced to the quote free market. So one group has people that probably have advanced far beyond their capabilities stand behind the president when he gets sworn in, and the other one gets billionaires that are leading a technological death cult. But either way, right? Like both of them, there is this assumption, right? When people have a disgust with our dominant sphere is like, do we part of what's problematic with everything getting reduced to politics, and then that there's a pluralism that isn't being resolved, is that you're now like, we don't have conversations about moral goods. So anytime someone's trying to reintroduce a depth dimension in these, it's attractive, even if it's connected to something crazy like JD Vance says or whatever, right? And there are leftist versions of this as well.
Yeah.
Um and and so I think that uh, it sets up where both political and corporate leaders present their decisions as rational or neutral, but in reality, they're wanting to enforce their ideological commitments and suppress actual debate, right? So. Uh, AOC not being in charge of the oversight committee and putting some old dude who can't use complete sentences with current cancer is a reason. Like, um, they anyway, in the last thing that um, uh, McIntyre talks about is that these things actually lead to a fragmented moral and social life, which is what I think you're trying to address.
Yeah.
Because those pre-modern societies, morality was integrated into communal life, and there's these shared virtues and narratives that end up guiding the individual in relationship to a collective, right? So then
Mm.
these other enactments come downstream. Modernity, in contrast, ends up promoting individualism and the privatization of morality, and that ends up leading to an alienation, moral confusion, erosion of genuine communities. And here's the sick part, and this is a Protestant's doing. We now, like, priesthood of the believer is now a burden we put on everyone. You the priest or the believer now in a pluralistically diffuse society, you now have to understand all your beliefs and articulate them rationally and defend them and blah, 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 blah. You now have to understand every situation to figure out what the good is. Now you as an individual are obligated to figure out what the good is and enact it. You are putting the burden of what a community in a shared community with virtues and narratives and really cooperation and support used to do on the individual, right? And what
Mm.
and
I
what
see.
and what I think the feedback or some of the responses, and this is a one of the points Charles Taylor makes at the beginning of the secular age when talking about this is um, McIntyre's recourse to tradition and neo-Aristotelian responses, and that's a whole nother conversation. But what one of the observations that Charles Taylor makes is that actually makes answering the question, what is the good life,
Yeah.
extremely difficult.
Yeah.
And you have to answer it for yourself. And when you recognize the trajectory of our economic system shaping culture, it's something you hope you work long enough and save enough for to eventually get to the good life. And the
Mhm.
good life was not a a category of deferral until the middle of modernity. Um, and it was a conversation you had in community,
Mhm.
not with yourself. And now, can we go back from that, or what do you do with that? There are lots of questions there, but when you raise that question of young people, I
Mhm.
think like, how do you answer the question, what is the good life? Before a typology of responses that content, and media message distinction uh, kind of could help set up for thinking about what would ecclesiology in this context look like.
Yeah.
Um, and in the same way, right, like democracies, uh, we opted out of the deliberative discourse because it was no longer an end in and of itself, right? So the political spaciousness to be in relationship across difference uh, ceased to be the primary incentive, and so instead of being in relationship with our citizens, we wanted to be right and lord over them, and that makes that generates a kind of asymmetrical power um, that swings based on whoever happens to be in the majority at any point, right? And so that's what we're experiencing now, is this kind of an asymmetrical swing because of 1% of the population voting
Oh,
one way.
Lord
But
help
could
us.
you imagine what would be the existential difference other than the ideas someone has if a progressive president came in and used authority in the same way and
Yeah.
ran over everything?
Yeah.
It would be like all of a sudden everyone gets to work and there's no more bathroom signs, and you're like, "It's not personal, it's just,"
Oh
like,
my gosh.
it's not like anyone's thinking of it, and it's actually setting up for each of these swings to run this way. Um, but sorry for my,
Dude, that was good. That was good. I will go back and listen to this, and, I wrote down, I mean, Tripp, literally, I wrote down, look at this. I taken notes of things to check back in with because, um so let me start with the context. Because I think addressing culture as a whole, it's so oversized and amorphous. It's right. So let's start with the context. So I think my problem, well, I have lots of problems, but specifically, my challenge here is that if you start with the context of our present atomization of the individual, that that's how people right in a socially constructed society That might be redundant. Um, as they conceptualize of themselves, right, in their social imaginary, if you start with an autonomous individual, you have a tough time, I would think, rounding the corner and bridging the gap into communal understanding and participation, a practice of cooperation, collaboration for the common good, right? That's a long haul. And I don't know that you could get there because people conceive of themselves as autonomous individual moral beings, right? Each of us is the captain of our own ship, right? So I think that context is the initial challenge. I'm thinking out loud here. So if the concern for folks like me who are part of religious communities and get at least part of our identity from participation in that communal structure, there's no way that we can begin by thinking this is going to work for everyone right away, right? So you would have to begin in a very local concern and try to persuade those who have the same concern to participate together, right? You can't start with belief. This isn't going to be a conceptual revolution. It's not going to start with some abstract concept or ideal, right? But if you see the same problem in this culture of conflict and crisis, and you can form allyships around a common concern and address that. So it would be in, smarty pants would call it praxis, a thoughtful practice, and then practicing on that reflection.
You got your
We-
thinking eyes.
So here, all right. I think the thing everyone can sort of agree on is that we're in trouble. We all recognize that this fragmentation, and I love, by the way, when we're reading people like Alistair McIntyre, when he talks about in his other book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, I think it's called. That we don't have a shared conception of the good, of morality, of character, of virtue. I mean, I think most people can agree that we're at the end of something. And what, like you said, and quoting, is that we have selected from these fragments and pieced them together in some sort of bricolage. But the problem is that the remnants, and this is, anyone you read will say this, the problem is that the remnants that we are piecing together in some sort of a fabricated, trying to weave them together in a, whether you call it a mosaic or a what do they call it, a tapestry, is that the remnants themselves are embedded. They come inherently with expectations of the past that are laden with things that we were trying to leave behind. Issues of racism, gender inequality, right? Economic disparity, the caste system. but the thing we can all agree on, even because there is no coherent, all of these fragments, they're incompatible at some level, right? They're incoherent there with each other. And so anything we can piece together, whatever tapestry or mosaic that we can uh try and assemble, is going to be flawed and have embedded inconsistencies in it, right? So, but the thing that we can all agree on is that something's wrong, right? And maybe this moment of cultural crisis can be the starting point, in that the fear, the scapegoating, the animosity could be our starting point.
Who knows?
Because otherwise, the the thing that I brought up with the radical Orthodox is they think the alternative is nihilism. Like,
Yeah.
this is
It's surprising how many people think not agreeing with them is nihilism.
So, all right, so that was point 1. We won't have time for point 2, but let me just introduce it so we can put a
I
pin
know,
in
'cause
it.
I'm about to go to the bathroom.
Okay, let me just introduce something else that we can
Ooh, a
talk about in the
teaser.
future. A little teaser. I think my biggest revelation in all of this research that I've been doing
Or
is
you tease it while I go to the bathroom, and then we can finish talking, because
it's up to
I've
you,
been
man.
holding it way too long, Bo.
Okay, it's up to you. Um, I think it's one of those things that's so obvious that you feel dumb for it suddenly, like, clicking, and you think, I should have known that before." I don't wanna admit that I just had an epiphany when that light bulb goes on, and you sort of, like, you don't wanna make it obvious and look around the room thinking, like, "Am I the only one this is dawning on?" But one of the big themes that I am finding, that I'm sort of, like, feeling the weight of, just the sheer gravity of, is that the new right, the alt-right, it gets called, or this conservative backlash, is not actually conservative. It's not trying, it's something new. It's not trying to conserve the past. It actually has learned a lesson from the progressive left, which is that we are in um, terra nova. We are in uncharted territory. And so it's a different kind of conservatism which has integrated our present situation with the desires and expectations of past societies, but in our new context, in our uncharted territory. And so any framework that I had of growing up in the 80s and 90s, of what conservatism was after and concerned about, what the telos was, the end goal, I've had to sort of erase off the whiteboard and repent of conceiving of that. It has helped me so much, Tripp, to realize that the new right, the alt-right, the this new brand of conservatives, it's not actually conservatism as traditionally constructed. I was saying that they have actually learned the lessons from the progressive left, that they're so critical of and integrated them into our new reality of the Terra Nova, the uncharted territory we find ourselves in. And so that's why some of their more outlandish claims and proclamations don't make sense if you try and hear them through a traditional filter of conservatism, and you think, what are they wait, what's this new thing? What are they doing? Where did this come from? And so I've had to step away, I would say erase my whiteboard of whatever I thought they were up to and sort of come at it with an open mind and open ears and say, sorry, I didn't catch that the first time. Can you say that again? Help me understand where that's coming from. And that has been one of my biggest revelations, and I'm sort of embarrassed at how monumental that epiphany has been. That probably should have dawned on me in the last 12 years that I've been studying this stuff. And but the reality of it has never, sometimes you need it to be so pronounced and for the volume to be so aggressively amplified that you hear something and go, oh, I
Well,
just caught what you were
I
saying.
would say one feature for yourself is congregations, prior to getting, to Idaho are in cities that, um, individuals that, if you take the big 5 personality features, one of the interesting things about cities on the West Coast is the likelihood that those that move into the city by choice, skew towards openness to new experiences and ideas and such in a rather dramatic way. So, like, Westwood in LA, uh, hipster Portland, like, so so you mentioned early on, maybe 6 or 7 months ago, when that it was like going back to a different time period
It
when you
is.
moved, but it's also going back to a different time period, and the percentage of people, uh, in the congregation who would, just the population will skew differently on openness to new ideas and change.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not even a evaluative assessment in some, like, this is better or worse. It's
Yeah.
just part of that sense of, "Oh, I have to rewrite the whiteboard," right? Is because the last 2 places you were places where having a whiteboard that resulted in, quick pace change and evolution of what the congregation's doing was like a sign of, "Oh, thank God," as opposed to the critical mass of it, seeing a whiteboard and suggesting new change, you're like, "What? Wh what? Oh, hold on." And so that's just part of getting to know a different context, both in where it is culturally, but also the personality, diagrams of, like, the critical mass in the congregation,
Yeah.
right? Somebody that grew up there that is what shows up at one of the other congregations you worked and was like, "I'm going to spend 5 years not changing anything and getting to know this congregation so I can be with them on their worst days." Like, if you showed up in Westwood and did that, 1, half the congregation would be different by the time that
That's
5
right.
years is up
That's right.
because they move in and out of there so much,
Yeah.
and they'd look at you like, "So what do you wanna do?" And you're like, "I am doing it." Like, we're learning how to be really effective at doing what we do, and, like, those cultural differences are real.
Wow.
So I wouldn't, uh freak out about it. But, like, even that difference, right? Think of how many people are excited about the new administration, and they probably lived in a place and have never, half this country's never moved more than 20 miles from where they're born, which makes no sense to me when I think of my friend group, which then just makes me think of how skewed all my friend group is.
Mm.
Um, so for those individuals, like, when at the national or at the cultural level, the good whiteboard ideas by
Interesting.
humanities degrees that, became friends at a protest and then
Yeah.
slowly started going to, a church service with you, Bo, those individuals are like, "Yeah, game on."
Yeah.
And then they show up at the gathering of all the Methodists, and they're like, "Why are they being so backwards?" I mean, open minds, open hearts, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, like, some of it is just
Mm.
the America includes, like, more diversity except for, you know, language, than exists in most of Europe. Like, if you really think
Yep.
about how different, like, you know, the states have whole the states, especially the parts that aren't, you know, turned into cities because of the, you know, business and university, the cultures are so different. My Where I lived in rural Arkansas has very little similar to where I lived in rural North Carolina. Like, there are
Huh.
things about it because it's rural,
Huh.
but, like, the uh, one of them is right next to a large number of military bases that then has, like, a whole thing, like, when your primary agricultural, stuff are tobacco and hogs is a very different world than, than when it's rice and trees, you know? If even if you, like, set a map over, right? So, if you are in rural Minnesota, um, you're likely grew up in an Lutheran congregation,
Yep.
and that is not the case in most places but, you know, so, like,
Yeah.
it all there's so much difference in this
And
country that
and
disappears if
even
you
if
move
you were a
around.
even if you were a non-Lutheran in a Lutheran context, you define yourself that way, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
still a part. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you're like, when is the fish fry?"
Hey, two things as we wrap up, I wanna put on the board. We can come back to later. One is, Trip, that thing you just said, I know you may not even know how right you are. Like, I have a whole bunch of things that are clicking in my head right now. For instance, I just recently joined the ecumenical ministers group in my area. And it was just an initial, it wasn't the big meeting, it was a smaller meeting of the mainline pastors. And of the six of us that were there, five of them, not me, everyone else grew up around here, left to go to school, and then came back and are here either taking care of their parents or have inherited a piece of land or a house. But every one of them is a local. And I, it really just struck me how profound, there's positives and negatives to that. But this appointment system that we have as Methodists, when you move in somebody who's never even been to the town or the area before, like, it is quite an adjustment to come into a context this different. Now, there's some advantages to that in that I bring maybe a skill set and an entrepreneurial spirit that maybe can benefit the church. But there's a downside in that people already have their friendship groups and their relational networks. And so it can be very lonely, and you can feel very alienated because sometimes the mentality and sort of the institutional cultural awareness, you very much feel like an outsider, and people can tell you're an outsider. Like, um, you seem like a transplant.
You got a lot of energy, Bo.
Last thing. Apparently, the Idaho legislature is debating right now whether to read Bible verses in the classroom in public schools, and my phone is blowing up.
Oh god. Well, as your Baptist friend,
Yeah.
you should just talk them down. Be like, "This is a bad idea." Um,
Oh
or
my.
or what if you were like, "Okay, but let's read the 300 verses on care for immigrants first. Let's do that, and then we can read the one about the how much God loves America. We can read all those Bible passages, um, and then yeah, like, it is just so funny. Like, do you realize this is what I'm talking about as to how, um, we we don't like, where both of us came from, like, are the kind of people that would simultaneously be like, "Well, that's not a bad question," except we thought that everyone actually read the Bible. No, they don't. They want random verses, probably read out of context, to their kids at school because what they think happens when it is
Yeah.
like just what they want.
Yeah.
And I I I just feel like there's some, like, basic things about Christianity in almost any view, you know?
Yeah.
Like, when, um, uh, w like, losing your biscuits because that the bishop was like, "We should consider, like, not being inhumane." And then, like, JD Vance going on saying, like, and then the Catholic bishops said, like, "Yeah, she has a point." And he gets mad, he's like, "They need to watch what they're doing," and getting all uppity about that, telling what to do. I'm just like, "No, like, this isn't even a weird part, like, not the 'Don't be a dick' pledge." It was is it's like you just got the day before was Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and the Pope agrees. So, like, when you're doing the Venn diagram of, is it Christian? When the Pope and Martin Luther King Jr. agree, there's a good good testing, and he's just like, "No basket." But, like, the number of people, that I just think to myself, "You want them to read that? You know that's dangerous. What happens if someone took it seriously at school?
Mhm.
Like, what if they read the Sermon on the Mount one day and someone was
Right.
like, 'Seems
Yeah.
reasonable.' Like, that might be a different way of existing in the world
Yeah.
than the one we're on." Um, the funny thing would be to show up and at the, city council meeting and take that approach. Be like, I'm really worried. If we were to read something like this out at school, what happens if they do it?
Tripp, that's really good.
Have you
What
forgiving
if
without
we
counting?
what if we came up with a proposal of the Bible verses that should be read if we're gonna read Bible verses in school?
Oh, no, a list of things not to read, and they're all Jesus lines.
Oh,
See,
man.
the Jefferson Bible cut out all the supernatural stuff.
Yeah.
The Trump Bible cuts out anything that involves a moral obligation to something other than your bottom line and coercive possession of power.
Ooh.
And then, like, you walk in there with, like, 10 pages, and you're like, "So I've already edited it."
I'm I d I did you all a favor by taking a first run at this.
Uh, Surprisingly, Romans rather short. "I greet you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Submit to the authorities. Amen."
I feel like something got left out there.
You can't put any of the things where you have something to ask for forgiveness for because Trump can't think of any. So
Oh my
like,
goodness.
that basically ruins Paul. No, I'm not gonna confess anything. No,
Tripp,
it's just locker room talk.
I know I don't need to thank you, but I want to thank you, for this morning. I have been stewing on this for 5 weeks,
Uh-oh.
since that Conserva Curious episode, and I have been looking forward to bringing this back around and trying to update it and expand it, and now you have given me, many, many rabbit trails to follow.
Well, you you can tell me what we're gonna talk about next time then, based on your rabbit trails. It'd be fun.
Sounds great. The good thing is, I don't think this crisis is going anywhere anytime
Nah,
soon. So, yeah, we'll have
true.
we'll
Plenty
have
of time.
plenty of time. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, friends, we'll,